Michael, we forgot about 3 Decembers. That's the 5th one. Anyway, I'm very pleased to be here to talk to you today about Jenůfa. This is an opera that inspires nothing but envy in every musical person I've ever told that I get to do a new production of it. It's become the way I stop conversations with conductors who are being annoying. I say, guess what I'm doing next? I get to do a new production of Jenůfa, at which point their jaws drop and their eyes get all beady and they tell me how it's on their bucket list. So, you'll enjoy it, I promise. One of the things I wanted to think about in talking to you about Jenůfa is what could I tell you that would be different than if we hired a musicologist or somebody else to do this preview. One of the things that has inspired us and intrigued us most about Jenůfa was how to design it. There's something about this opera in particular and the work of Janacek in general that makes us need to design differently and perhaps better than some of the other work we do. Maybe it's because his music is inherently more modern and more challenging, and by that I don't mean scary and atonal. I just mean it's not Russian romantic. Maybe it's that, maybe it's because of the tradition that he comes out of that makes us have to do this. So I thought that if I talk to you about what it's like to design a show and then apply to those principles to Jenůfa, perhaps I could give you some insights into the things that we're trying to bring out this summer and what it is that we're finding particularly inspiring. So, the Czech Republic has a really strong theatrical tradition. It's a very literate society, about 99% literacy rate. Poetry is important, theater is important, opera is important. And they have always had this wonderful history of doing theater design that's really interesting and really forward-thinking and kind of abstract. In the library at Simpson, I found this wonderful book about modern Czech theatrical design, and it had a lot of imagery in it and a CD-ROM of images. Now, it's unusual because you wouldn't find the equivalent book about modern French theater design. You might for Britain, but there's something kind of unique about the way that the Czech people approach theater. This is a design for a production of Gogol's The Tutor, and I thought it was really beautiful and really interesting. This for a production of The Wood Demon. It actually speaks to me a little bit about Jenůfa as well. That's sort of the tie-in. This is a backdrop for a production of Antony and Cleopatra. So I just put these images in so you can see something of what the kind of visuals are that the music, the history, and the theater of these people inspire. So, what do we do when we design for Czech opera? When I design anything at this point, I ask myself 3 questions. What does the set have to do? What should it say? And what should it feel like? What does it need to do? This is the practical stuff. This is the boring stuff. This is how do we get from one scene to the next and do it in your wonderfully intriguing, annoying space that has the world's slowest elevator out on the playing circle, no fly space, and I have to share it with 2 other shows. Okay. But it's a beautiful space as well, and it's a space that allows me to do things like I can do in no other place. Bohème. What did it need to do? Well, what it needed to do was be able to go from this garret, which was, you know, sparse and interesting and let us do all of those scenes, to here, the Christmas market, in 2 minutes. In a theater with very little fly space, the slowest elevator in the world, and then I'm sharing it with 2 other shows. So the way we did it, I mean, this is just sort of the practical thing that Keith and I sit around talking about. How do you go from A to B? And the answer is it flipped around. I don't know if you knew that the garret turned around and became Momus. The door out of the garret was the door into Momus. And everything else just got pushed on from the sides. So that's one sort of practical thing that we deal with. Another is Dead Man Walking. You remember, those of you who heard me talk about Dead Man in this same Guild preview last year, that what I was complaining about was 17 scene changes in 2 hours. Still complaining about 17 scene changes in 2 hours. So the challenge in a show like Dead Man is how do I move seamlessly from space to space without seeing a lot of human beings pushing stuff around, because Dead Man is a show that was largely located in Sister Helen's head. So it had to move in a really theatrical and interesting kind of way that allowed me to do things like a really intimate scene like this out on the playing circle, isolate her alone in an atmosphere that spoke about the prison, or create levels in a theater where it's not always the easiest to create levels, right? So that's the second challenge, is just bopping from place to place to place to place. Sometimes the challenge, as in Grimes, is about giving us enough room that there's a place for the chorus to be. Grimes is primarily a chorus opera. They spent most of the first act on the stage, and we needed to have a place where we could have activities that made sense, isolate little principal scenes in a larger scope. So that's the first thing. What does a set need to do? But it's much more interesting to talk about what story should a set tell. I'm a big believer that when you walk into a good theater or opera production, or dance for that matter, that the set itself should be telling you something about the world of the opera, that it should have a story, that it should tell you something about the people who live in that world. So, again, using productions that you might have seen as an example. In Dead Man, obviously we needed to create a prison, but I was very interested in the notion of shifting perspectives and how I could use your space at DMMO to say something about the way the opera forces us to look at the people in the opera. So the first time you saw David Adam Moore, he was up on stage, and we looked at him the same way Sister Helen looked at him. She was out on the playing circle, looking at him with you, and he was framed by barbs. The next two times you saw him, he was on one of the bridges and she was on another bridge, separated by the orchestra pit. Separated by the orchestra pit at its widest dimension, so the widest gulf between them. In the second act, you saw them together, because they're coming together. You see them both in the context of the prison. And at the end of the opera, we've shifted it 180 degrees, and suddenly he's out there with you, and we're looking at her. So, you may not have realized it, but I think it made a huge psychological difference to the way the show felt. He's freed of the bars. Sister Helen did say to him, the truth would set him free. And he's out with us. We've humanized him in more than one way as a result of the design. Sometimes it's just about letting the audience know that we're doing something different. This is a picture of my production of Don Giovanni. When the curtain went up at Kentucky Opera, this is what the audience saw. So they knew immediately that we were probably doing something set in the 1950s based on film noir, and that this wasn't your grandma's production of Don Giovanni, which it wasn't. If you curtain went up and you saw this, you would immediately understand, here's a Gilbert and Sullivan just for you, that we were in a topsy-turvy world. A lot of color, a world that is both Asian and a little Western, a world that is weird, basically, right? A production of Così that looks like this with umbrellas hanging in the air tells you that, again, weird, fun things are going to happen. That in the second act it's all going to get a little more sensual, a little more mystery, a little more possibility. This is End of the Affair, wonderful J.K.'s second opera, which he laughingly, or sometimes not so laughingly, refers to as the end of his career, because it wasn't a success. We did a very good production of it that Keith Brumley designed for Lyric Opera of Kansas City. It's an opera about faith. It's based on a Graham Greene novel. And this scene, more than any other, the bigness of the cathedral, the smallness of her fragility in this space, told you something about the show and the relationship of faith to the characters in it. Onegin. So in Onegin, obviously, we were doing it set in its period in Mother Russia. We wanted it to feel Russian. We wanted it to be very evocative of the Russian countryside and freedom, and to allow for moments like this. But Keith designed all of those verticals and all of those horizontals so that at other points, even though things were very beautiful, they could also feel very stifling. This is the end of the first act when Tatiana had just learned that Onegin has given back her letter and told her, don't act so childish, don't be so stupid. And she's devastated. And suddenly it looks a little bit like she's imprisoned by all of those verticals and all of those horizontals. We used the same principle in creating the trees for the duel. Of course, we know that trees grow from the bottom up, but we chose to hang the trees from the top down and make them come to points because we thought it was more, dangerous, right? You know that this is not your average birch forest. This is a birch forest where something terrible is going to happen. And Barry Steele, our lighting designer, actually created a lighting gobo, which is a kind of frame that goes in the light. to create, you can just see it there, those diagonal lines on the floor that look like they're coming from the trees. So when we got to this moment, the set design itself was telling you something very, very bad is going to happen in this space, and they are basically imprisoned by the rules that govern their lives and the duel that they're about to have. In Grimes, it was about creating a world that was very fractured, very a kilter. I spoke a lot in various previews and articles of Grimes about how it was an opera about war and a society that had been torn apart by hatred, and the way that that hatred got turned internally onto people inside the village, like Grimes himself. So I didn't want to make a sweet little English fishing village. I wanted to make a set that told that same story. How should it feel? So this is the sort of touchy-feely part of set design. When I get into this part of the design meetings, Keith always rolls his eyes a little bit at me. But this is the place where I bring art into the mix. And by art, I mean visual art. I think it's always really interesting and really important for us to consider operas in the context of the other art that was being created while the operas were being written. So a lot of times we'll look at paintings and other visual media that come from the time period. It's usually about something I want you to feel that isn't just specifically about the geography of the set. So perhaps the best example is Peter Grimes. We were really inspired by the war art of John Piper, as many of you know. Piper's fractured, weird landscapes and his really strong use of color. Color can be a really positive thing, but in the Grimes world, I thought of color as representing really strong, usually negative emotion. A painting by Donald Hamilton, who's kind of followed on from John Piper and does exactly the same thing. Keith Brumley, for Grimes, created a series of paintings which we then photographed and turned into the projections. So you can see how the John Piper and Donald Hamilton paintings inspired projections like that, which represented the hate of the village, and projections like that, which represented Grimes's alternate vision of the world. And of course, a man who sees that when he sings the Great Bear and Pleiades aria doesn't belong in that society, which was the essence of the opera. So, how does all of this relate to Jenůfa? Now, I would be remiss if I didn't tell you the normal kind of previewy things about the opera, so here we go. It's based on a play by a Moravian playwright named Gabriela Prasova. Sir? The play in Czech is actually referred to as Její pastorkyně, and it means her stepdaughter. Jenůfa is the stepdaughter, and the her that it refers to is the character of Kostelnička, the role that will be sung by Brenda Harris. Kostelnička is the second daughter of a rich family, rich-ish family, in a small village. And it's not even her first name, Kostelnička, it's actually a title. It means the sextoness. She was married to the sexton of the church, which was a very respected position. And so she herself is referred to as Kostelnička. And technically, it's the Kostelnička, although we never say it that way. Prasova had only been in Moravia for about a year before she started writing plays about the people that she saw and about things that had happened in the village. And Její pastorkyně was one of the first. She wrote it in 1890, and it immediately destroyed her career. People thought it was too harsh. They thought it was not possible that the events that she described in the play could really have happened, which Prasova was really confused by because she'd based it on real events. She had the newspaper clippings to prove it. But the point is that people wanted a portrait of village life that was about happy peasants, and she wasn't very interested in happy peasants. She was interested in the emotional life of her characters and about telling people how it really was, rather than some idealized, romanticized, kind of Russian romantic portrait of what village life was. So her career didn't do terribly well after that, but Janacek saw the play and was immediately taken with it and knew that he wanted to set it. So he contacted her and said, "May I please turn your play into an opera?" And she remembered almost 50 years later that he said to her, "I can hear whole phrases of it in my head, and I know that's why it needs to be an opera." So she agreed, figuring it would give it a little more life. So, this is Janacek. He did very well at the adapting of the libretto. I'm on record as saying that I think it's a really bad choice for any composer to write their own libretto. It always leads to disaster. But in Janacek's case, it was a very, very good choice. He took the text straight from the play, cut about a third of it, kept all the major characters, and did a lovely job of boiling down the story. As I was saying, it's basically the story of a family, the Burias. There's an older grandmother. There were 2 sons who both married women that had children by other marriages and then died. One of those women is Kościelniczka. Kościelniczka has a stepdaughter as a result of this named Jenůfa. There were also 2 young men of Jenůfa's same generation in the family, Števa, who is the first grandson, meaning he is the first son of the first son, who will inherit the mill, and his foster brother, stepbrother, but actually his half-brother, named László. László will not inherit anything. According to Czech tradition, it's the eldest child, the firstborn, that gets everything, and if you're second or third in line, you're basically out of luck. So Janacek focused on keeping all of the same themes that Prešová had in her play, and he was really interested in something called speech melody. The idea being that he would listen to how people actually talked, write it down, and try to create music out of it. He was really, really good at setting text. And the writing of Jenůfa went pretty well to begin with, and then it was interrupted, mostly by work that he did on other pieces. He got back to it in the late 1890s and early 1900, and then the writing of the opera was interrupted by the events surrounding his daughter Olga. This is Olga. Olga was the apple of Janacek's eye. She made a poor choice in 1900 to become engaged to a young medical student, and Janacek did not approve, so he made her break it off. She rather stubbornly continued the relationship, but then heard some bad things about her fiancé, so she did eventually break off the relationship. The fiancé, former fiancé, freaked out and started to stalk her and said the next time he saw her, he would kill her. So Janacek thought it would probably be a good idea to get Olga out of town, and she was sent to St. Petersburg in 1902. The thought being a little space would probably do these hot-headed young people some good, and she could work on her Russian. Janacek thought that was a nice idea. Sadly for everybody, what actually happened is that she came down with typhoid, and she became so sick that Janacek and his wife Zdenka actually had to stop what they were doing and go and take care of her in St. Petersburg. Janacek came back to Brno, where he lived, and kept working on the opera, and eventually Olga was allowed to come home. But she didn't get better. By the time she got home, she couldn't walk. It had spread to her heart and her kidneys. She developed a horrifying case of rheumatoid arthritis that made her be in constant pain. All the while, Janacek is writing Jenůfa. And it is not an underestimation to say that the pain that you hear in the opera, and Jenůfa's pain when her child dies, is the pain that Janacek felt as Olga was dying, and maybe Olga's pain herself. Olga knew that she wouldn't live to hear Jenůfa performed. And when it became clear to Olga that she was in fact dying, she asked her father to play her the whole score. So he went and got the manuscript and sat in the library with her and played it from start to finish. And she told him that she thought it was wonderful, and died 3 days later. Janacek buried the last page of the opera score in her coffin with her and dedicated the opera to Olga. There's another piece of music written in Olga's memory, but it's really Jenůfa that is about the loss that Janacek felt. Nonetheless, he finished the opera, which he wrote directly into full score. He did not write it, unlike his other works, into piano, vocal, and then orchestrated. He heard whole musical phrases in his head. So, orchestrally, it went very, very well. And the opera premiered in 1904 in Brno. Now, Janacek had big aspirations by this point, and he really wanted the opera to be performed by the National Theatre in Prague. That was going to make his reputation as an opera composer. However, sadly, Janacek had violated one of the great rules of opera. If I could teach our apprentices nothing else, it would be this: be nice to everyone, because someday they're going to be running an opera company. Yeah. So in 1887, Janacek was working as a music critic, and he had attended the world premiere of a new opera called The Bridegrooms, a comic opera. And he wrote, "Is this dramatic opera? No, I would write on the poster, comedy performed together with music, since the music and the libretto aren't in any way connected to each other." Yeah. Okay. The composer was this man, Karl Kavarovitz, also a conductor, who became, of course, the head of the National Theatre in Prague and its music director just when Janacek wanted to get Jenůfa performed there. So Janacek sent the score to Jenůfa, to the theatre. Kavarovitz didn't even dignify it with a response. The general director of the theatre was given the job of responding to Janacek, and he said, "We would wish the work to meet with complete success on stage, for your sake, as well, of course, as for ours. But we are afraid that your work would not have this kind of success." And they rejected it. Still, Janacek persevered. Kavarovitz was invited 19 times to see Jenůfa performed, and he refused each and every time. The 20th, something magical happened. He finally came to see the piece and decided he hated it. There you go. Don't be nasty to anybody. They're going to be running an opera company. Eventually, Janacek's friends intervened, and Janacek ate a lot of crow and apologized for the review. And Kavarovitz agreed to take another look at Jenůfa. He agreed that with a little work, maybe they could perform the piece. And I think Janacek assumed a little work meant what you would say a little work means. A little nip, tuck, a little cut. No. What Kavarovitz wanted to do was basically redo the whole thing. And he took a red pencil to the score and removed everything that was in any way interesting about the way the piece worked. All of the rough edges that actually make Janacek's music what it is were smoothed over. He made it sound like Russian Romanticism, and he completely reorchestrated the piece. And it was this version that was performed in the National Theatre in Prague in 1916. It's this version of the opera that made Janacek's opera composing career. It's this version of the opera that was performed until the 1980s. It's this version that most people knew. Janacek never again heard his opera as he intended it. Once he got famous, later on, he repudiated all of those versions. Kavarovitz went so far as to ask for royalties and to be listed as a second composer on the piece, which just drove Janacek nuts. And after Janacek's death, his wife repudiated all the royalty claims as well. Well, we would be stuck with this Kavarovitz version if it were not for the work of the Australian conductor and musicologist Charles McCarrish. McCarrish decided that there must be a way to restore what Janacek wanted. So he traveled to Brno and got the original orchestra parts, which were kept there in a library in a sort of dusty case. And by looking at the original violin parts and cello parts and everything else, he could see what the orchestration was actually meant to sound like. He actually got Kavorovitz's original score, the score where Kavarovitz took the red pencil and went and cut things. And so by then lifting out all of those cuts, he could basically restore the opera. The score that McCarrish put together in the 1980s was published, and then he recorded it twice. So a few of you have said to me, oh, I've heard Jenůfa, and I've asked, what recording do you have? This is why that question's important. If you've heard any version of Jenůfa recorded before about 1982, you've never heard Jenůfa. We're going to do the restored version. We're going to do what Janacek wanted to do. It's now become accepted practice, and we can get the orchestra parts for it. So you'll hear what it was meant to sound like. But an interesting thing happened in the design meetings. I was telling this same story, and Barry Steele, our lighting designer, suddenly went very pale. And I said, Barry, what's wrong? And he said, well, I've done Jenůfa before, but I did it in Sarasota, a slightly strange opera company known for doing things exactly as they are in a particular way in a particular score. He said, I have a really bad feeling that I've never done Jenůfa either. Sure enough, I had my computer, I started playing for him the McCarrish recording, and Barry said, no, this isn't the music I know at all, I have to start over. But he's now completely in love with the real thing. But I thought it was interesting to actually work with somebody that had had the experience of working on the previous version, and now will work on our restored version. So the big shame is that what Kavarovitz did made Janacek's music not sound like Janacek. Jenůfa is the first piece where we hear Janacek's really distinctive musical voice. It is a piece in which the setting of the text was given great primacy by Janacek. The words and phrases are often repeated. So you'll have a character say something and then say it again and say it again. And each time it's set slightly differently to give a slightly different emphasis. And by that sheer repetition, it takes on a new importance and a new kind of, emotional feeling to it. Janacek believed really strongly in doing something with the orchestra that was also very different than, let's say, Wagner and other people were doing at the end of the 19th century. He didn't think that the orchestra was the only way of creating emotion or telling the story dramatically. He believed the voice itself should do that, and that the orchestra should back up the singer, and not the other way around. That the orchestra should be a partner in that kind of storytelling. That the voice should actually have primacy. And some of the most interesting moments in Jenůfa are actually unaccompanied. You'll have a huge swell in the music, and then suddenly the orchestra dies away, and all you're left with is the human voice. And I think because he's done it in that way, we pay so much more attention to what it is that's being said. The piece also has a really modern structure. It's through-written, and it's not a numbers opera, so it's not like Verdi. There are not arias that you can necessarily excerpt. There are bits that we do take out for auditions and such, but there aren't that many ensembles. It's mostly a series of dialogues and monologues, so it feels very much like a play that's been set to music, wonderful music, which is what it is. It is not a folk opera. You will hear people talk about Janacek's relationship to folk music, but this is not Happy Peasants. Please do not come expecting happy peasants. There will be peasants, but they will not be happy. They are Czech peasants. It's unsentimental in its realism. It's not verismo, but it's related to verismo. So it is not Cavalleria, it is not Pagliacci, and it is not Bohème. It's not just about the facts of what happens. What Janacek is interested in is the same thing that Prasova was interested in. He's interested in the spiritual and emotional growth of the characters. The incredible human ability to be changed by events and to change your moral outlook as a result of it. Every major character in the opera undergoes a moral shift, except for one. And it's fascinating to realize that even the darkest characters are capable of great change. It is ultimately a tragic opera with a happy ending. The soprano doesn't die. And technically, since the baby doesn't sing, nobody dies. Well, I'm trying here for the happy ending. It is an opera about love and redemption. I said this last year about Dead Man Walking, and I guess I'm still on the same thing. So, to go back to this idea of what does a set need to do. Actually, hold on, let me go back for a second. How does all of that design stuff I talk about then relate to this wonderfully restored production of Jenůfa? Well, for once, the gods have smiled on me, and I don't need to do 17 scene changes. The first act is set at a mill, and the second and the third acts are set in the same place. That's the first time that's happened to me here at DMMO, and I'm really looking forward to it. Little preview, I will not be using the elevator. Okay. It's not about recreating a village, because both the mill and the house of the second and third acts are isolated. And it's important that they be isolated, that they not be seen in the context of some happy little peasant village. It's about things that kind of happen on the outskirts. Levels were nice, I said to Keith, but I didn't really care so much. The one thing I knew we needed was the mill wheel to turn. Janacek was really interested in this idea of the mill, and he went out to some different mills as part of his research, and he listened to the sound that they made, and he wrote it down musically, and he puts it in the score. So I said to Keith, we have to have a mill wheel that turns, because I think that's important. Okay, so that's all it needs to do, though. I mean, that's a pretty short list for me when I sit in design meetings. What's more interesting is to think about what story does it need to tell. So, the mill. The biggest thing I need you to understand about the mill is that it's more important than every human being on stage. Literally bigger, but ultimately it's about the fact that this family has thrown all of its eggs into this basket. They've decided that who inherits the mill and how the money works is more important than their relationship as a family. A minute and 34 into the opera, Latza starts singing about the mill and the fact that he's been cut out of the family fortune. And every major character in the first act will sing about that stupid mill, except for one, Jenůfa. It's almost like she's in a different opera. She doesn't care, literally. She's got something else on her mind. She's pregnant by her cousin Steva. She's engaged to be married, but she needs to get married pretty quick or it's going to be a huge problem. Steva comes home drunk, Kostelnichka prevents the marriage, and suddenly Jenůfa is in crisis. So the girl's got a lot on her mind. She's not so concerned about who's running the mill. We looked at pictures of mills. We wanted to figure out about big structures. This is a production from Malmö, Sweden. What I love about it is the imposing nature of that structure. You understand, looking at this picture, that that building is important and that it's bigger than those people in some way. So we're designing a mill that feels very much the same way. In Act 2, Kostelnichka thinks she's got everything under control. She's told everyone that Jenůfa went off to Vienna, and in fact she's hidden Jenůfa in her house on the outskirts of the village for months. Jenůfa's had the baby, nobody knows except for Steva. And Kostelnichka figures out that Jenůfa's life could be made so much better if the baby didn't exist. And Kostelnichka keeps saying, you know, if the stupid little thing just weren't here. Sadly for Kostelnichka, the baby's just fine. It's perfectly healthy, it's a week old, it doesn't even cry. Perfect child. And Kostelnichka comes up with a plan, a horrifying plan, to tell Jenůfa that the baby has died and to drown the baby in a frozen river. Figuring that the baby, all evidence of the baby will be gone by spring when the ice melts and everything will be fine and Jenůfa will be free to resume her life. So I wanted to design something in the second act that told you something about a precarious situation. And Keith brought this picture to the design meetings, and I thought it was so interesting. Kostelnichka is convinced she's got it under control, and yet we immediately know that she doesn't. That everything is literally resting on one little beam. And this picture has provided the greater portion of the inspiration for the second act set. It's also winter, and I'm really into seasons. If you saw Onegin, you know that I kind of did the whole falling leaves thing. I snowed on the playing circle in Berlin, blah, blah, blah. So, frozen. Because it's more than just about the fact that Kostelnichka drowns a baby in a frozen river. It's about the fact that they're frozen, she's frozen, everything is cold. She's literally cold-hearted. And I found these pictures, and we were all very, very taken with this idea of how to encrust things with ice, and the feeling that that would give you about this world. This is from a movie called The Day After Tomorrow. Keith actually found this one. We thought that was kind of interesting. What does snow inside mean psychologically? In Act 3, it's spring, but we're in the same place. So I knew that I needed to be able to take away the snow and transform the space in some way, and that it was going to involve color. And one of the interesting things in a Czech wedding ceremony is this use of ribbons. You'll hear dialogue in the opera about ribbons. The day before a bride gets married, all of her friends get together and they decorate a tree, either a little standing tree inside or a tree outside her house with ribbons and with colored eggs hung on the tree like little ornaments. It's sort of a beautiful idea. So we're going to incorporate that and the idea of Czech ribbons into our third act set. It gives it a very springy feel. So that's the story that we're trying to tell. But what should it feel like? How should Jenůfa feel? So for this, I thought the best way I could explain to you how I want you to feel is to play you some of my favorite excerpts from the opera and to pair it with paintings that have become particularly meaningful to me as we did this work. Remember, I said this is the place where I usually bring in the art. This is usually the place where I'm madly Googling who was painting or sculpting or writing at the time that our composers were composing. So, this is Bohumil Kubista. He's a turn-of-the-century Czech painter, the founder of the Czech modern school, a cubist, an expressionist. To me, this painting, like Grimes, speaks a little bit about fracture. There's a lot of isolation, but given the color palette, there's also a sense of harmony in it. You get a sense of community out of it. So, those of you that have read the Vivace magazine know that I wrote a really kind of nerdy article about my favorite bit of Act 1. And that's the bit I would like to play for you now. In this bit of Act 1, Jenůfa has just learned that she's not going to be allowed to marry Števa in time for the baby. And Števa has been very, very mean to her about it. And she's devastated. And suddenly, her grandmother speaks up. And Grandma says, "And you, Jenůfa, don't cry. Each couple must its own troubles endure." And it starts out as just one fractured little line, and suddenly the mill foreman joins, and then the chorus joins, and eventually you'll hear Jenůfa's voice come in over the top of it. And it's a tremendous moment of musical harmony. It's the only moment of true unison in the entire piece. And as I said in the Vivace article, it feels like a bit of old wisdom. It feels like a folk melody, even though it's not. Janacek wrote this himself. So let's go ahead and have a listen to Grandma Buria's very good advice in Act 1 of Jenůfa. Good, huh? It was worth a Vivace article. That last sound you heard, that little toot, that's the mill wheel. Janacek puts it in to remind us of kind of the way life has to go on. Yeah. But you hear what I mean about everyone joining in, this amazing unison, and then I think the most interesting bit of it is in the middle, when the orchestra suddenly drops away and you have that incredible kind of a cappella moment. And I think we pay attention to it all the more because he's given us the amazing orchestra swell right before. He really knew what he was doing in terms of making us pay attention. So it is very modern music in many ways, but it is also extremely sensual music. It is at times extremely feminine, and there is this wonderful sensitivity that he brings out in each of the characters. So when I look for images that inspire me about peace, I have a huge box of paintings and postcards at home, and I literally just dump them all out on the floor of my studio, and 99% of them go back in the box. And then there's this 1% that remains that just speak to me in some way about peace. And one of them was this Rodin sculpture. And when I saw it sitting on the floor of my studio, it reminded me of Jenůfa. The supplication of it, the sensuality of it, the femininity of it. And interestingly, the character that I'm going to pair it with is Kościelniczka. In most of the opera, she's a shrew. It'll be a good challenge for Brenda Harris, since we like her so much. Kościelniczka has had a hard life. Her husband was abusive to her when she was a young woman. He was a drunk. He spent all their money. And when she called him on it, he beat her so much that she ran off into the fields and would hide from him at night. This is the life she's trying to save Jenůfa from. So we understand that her shrewiness comes from a very deep and genuine desire to protect Jenůfa. And even though Števa is her nephew, she hates him because he's young and stupid and a good for nothing, and Jenůfa's dumb to love him, but she does, because good girls always fall for bad boys. You know this to be true. One of the things that Janeček does is he enables Kościelniczka to have moments of tremendous sensitivity whenever she talks about Jenůfa. Jenůfa is the one thing that brings out her softer side. Now Jenůfa is not even her blood. She's technically her foster daughter, for that means stepdaughter in this society. But Kościelniczka treats her as her own. And in the second act, Kościelniczka drugs Jenůfa, gives her a little sleeping potion, and invites Števa to the house to see the baby. And Kościelniczka is convinced that if Števa would just hold his son, that he would be filled with love, that he would accept the baby, that he would marry Jenůfa, and everything would work out. And she can't get Števa to put his hands on the child. She can't get him to even really look at the kid. So she says, come and look at him and see how he's just like you. And on my knees, I beg you, do not abandon my foster daughter, my only joy. Do not leave her in shame. And she sings it so beautifully and so tenderly that Števa starts to cry, and the last thing she says to him is, "Are you crying?" So let's hear this little excerpt from the second act, which is the moment that stops me in my tracks when I learned this. If you're Števa, your heart should melt, right? What does he do? Turns on his heel and runs out of the house. Never takes his son in his arms. He's the character that doesn't change. But that music is a little preview of Kościelniczka's tremendous ability to change later in the opera. In the third act, of course, she does regret what she's done. The body of the baby is discovered when the ice melts. It's Latza and Jenůfa's wedding day, and the wedding is destroyed because the whole town realizes that the baby has been killed. They make the assumption that it's Jenůfa herself that has killed the baby, and Kościelniczka is suddenly faced with a terrible, terrible choice. And she throws herself on her knees in front of the town and begs Jenůfa's forgiveness and says, I alone am the murderess. And you realize that everything she wanted for Jenůfa and for herself has literally come crashing down around her. And Jenůfa, this extraordinary creature who didn't care about the money at the beginning, turns to her stepmother and says, of course I forgive you. Of course I do. And Kościelniczka has this moment of insight, and she says, I realize now that I have loved myself more than I loved you. And the mayor and the townspeople take Kościelniczka away to face her trial. And Jenůfa and László are left alone together. This is a painting by Franciszek Kupka. I thought in bringing this, which I think is an extraordinary work, he's a great Czech modernist painter, to the design meetings, that this would really blow everybody's mind, because it's so beautiful and so modern and so interesting and so full of color. And there's this kind of striving towards that light, and it feels redemptive. And Keith Brumley looked at me and said, oh yeah, he's one of my favorite painters. I knew him, and I encountered his work first in grad school, which I just thought was so funny, because it's taught me that I can't really teach Keith Brumley anything new. But for me, Kupka's work kind of celebrates this redemptive quality that is at the heart of this opera that has tragedy in it, but ultimately wants us to look for the light at the end of the tunnel. So once Kościelniczka is taken away, Jenůfa assumes that László will not marry her, and she says, go on, follow them. And László looks at her and says, no, it's you I want to be with. It's been you all along. There is nothing in the world that I would not suffer for you. And Jenůfa suddenly realizes that this strange, violent outsider of a man is the true love of her life, and that he's been there for her all along. And I think she really looks at him for the first time in the entire piece. And she says, László, the love that you have inspired in my heart is so pure that I know God is smiling on us. So now I want to, this is the very end of the opera. And I want to play you this because whenever I get here in my study, I know that whatever Michael puts me through at DMMO will be worth it. extraordinary. And in getting to know it and sharing some of it with you, I've realized why I've inspired a kind of death envy in all of the conductors that I've been talking to recently. This is the companion piece to that other Kupka painting. And to me, it seems like the completion of the circle, Lhasa and Jenůfa finally together. So when you come this summer and see what it is we've done, and see the rather unusual but really inspired design that Keith Brumley has come up with, I hope that some of what I've told you will make sense, and that you will see in this opera the strength of these people, their ability to change, and ultimately the redemptive quality of love that so preoccupied Janacek. Thank you.